Welcome to my messy studio, everyone. My name is Mark, and I'm an artist and an art professor. And in this video, we're going to take a look at 3 fully archival, waterproof brown inks designed to be used in fountain pens. I'm going to run them through my series of tests, and then as a bonus, show you 3 different ways to use them for sketching. Let's get started. But before I do, give me a second to tell you about my YouTube membership program, which will give you access to a library of long-form classes and 2 new classes every single month. This is a great way to support my channel and allows me to make in-depth instructional content for a small, select group of people without feeling the algorithmic pressure to produce content that appeals to a mass audience. Okay, back to the regularly scheduled programming. Not so long ago, when the topic of fountain pens came up with my artist friends, I found that they had 2 main objections to their use. One is that fountain pen inks are not waterproof, and 2, that they're not archival, meaning that they're prone to fading with time and light exposure. My usual response was to tell them to get with the times, because nowadays several companies produced pigmented archival inks that are fully waterproof. What I neglected to tell them was that the colors were severely limited, basically to black. Well, fortunately for us artists, that situation has been remedied, with a number of manufacturers making archival, waterproof inks in a variety of colors. And of all the light-fast and archival colors now available to the artist, I can't think of any color more useful than brown. Why? Well, it's a traditional color that's encountered in many old master drawings, and I love giving my work an old-time feel. But besides that personal preference, there are other reasons why brown ink is such a good choice for a variety of drawing purposes. First, it's slightly lighter than black, which makes for softer, less graphic drawings. Second, it's more suitable for drawing the figure, where brown does a great job giving the impression of warm, living flesh. And third, in landscape, when used in combination with watercolor washes, the warmth of the color contrasts beautifully with the generally cooler colors found in nature, providing a vibrancy of color that you just can't get with black. This is why I have so many brown inks in my collection, but so far I have to admit only one of them is fully waterproof, Document Brown, made by D. Atramentis. This is an excellent, consistent, rich, dark brown that works equally well in a pen as in washes, which I have a full review of on my channel. But since the old masters used a wide range of different browns, and because I was curious to see what else was out there, I decided to buy a few more brown inks and experiment with them. 2 of these are fairly new to the market, Rohrer and Klingner Lily, which is a dark sepia color. Then on the other end of the brown spectrum, a light yellowish brown made by Diamine called Butterscotch. And then an ink that's been around for quite a while that I never got around to using, Sepia Brown made by Platinum. All of these are pigmented and advertised as being archival and waterproof. Let's start by testing out the Rohrer and Klingner Lily ink. I'm working on Strathmore 300 Series Bristol paper with a smooth surface, a good general paper for testing ink. The name of the pen will be listed in the description section, but what's important is that it's fitted with a very wet, flexible steel nib, which will help us gauge the wetness of the pen. Our test begins with what I call an ink blob sea monster, where I wet the paper in places and put down washes of ink. This allows the ink to move around on its own, and if it's composed of multiple coloring agents, separate out. In previous ink tests, I used chromatography paper to break down the constituent coloring agents. This unfortunately does not work with waterproof ink, but even if it did, I found that chromatography doesn't really demonstrate how the ink will behave in practice, whereas a test like this does. Though advertised as dark brown, this ink is perhaps more of a warm dark gray. While it's clearly composed of multiple coloring agents, and you will see purplish stains when cleaning your pen, in practice it seems to separate out slightly between a neutral gray and a slightly warmer yellowish component. This is more visible while the ink is still wet, however, and when dry, the color is much more uniform. The term shading, for you non-fountain pen people, refers to the transparency of the ink. While shading can make lines and washes look less even, this property in waterproof ink is quite useful, since the transparency allows you to build up darker values with multiple applications. In terms of color variation, I initially rated the ink as high, but that's only because I was looking at it when it hadn't fully dried. In retrospect, the color is actually fairly uniform, a warm grayish brown or brownish gray. In the flow department, this ink performed very well. This pen has a super flexible, ink-hungry nib, so the ink flow has to be generous in order for it to work well, and here it does, putting down juicy but controlled lines. And in the all-important water resistance test, it did moderately well. Bristol paper is fairly hard and non-absorbent, and is therefore an unforgiving surface for waterproof fountain pen inks, whose waterproof properties come from the micropigments in the ink penetrating the paper surface and binding to the paper fibers. When applied heavily on non-absorbent papers, part of the ink remains on the surface, becoming residue that can be washed away. That's what we're seeing here. Since this ink performed much better on more absorbent papers, I still rank the waterproof properties high, though less than completely perfect. Now let's do a quick landscape sketch with this ink and talk about whether it would be a useful addition to your ink collection. This ink has seen way more use than the other two inks I'm going to show you because it's the one I took with me this summer to Spain, where I drew with it almost every single day. I chose it because of its versatility. First, this is a dark neutral color and in some pens very close to black, which makes it great for just regular drawing. But because it's also slightly transparent, it's softer, less graphic, and easier to work with than a pure black ink. When working in combination with watercolor, the fact that it has a gentle warmth and color complexity allows it to blend more organically with the colors placed over it. There are times when I enjoy the strong contrast between a solid black ink and color washes. But there are motifs and ways of working that call for a gentler approach, where the line work does not play such a prominent part, and for this purpose, this ink is perfect, becoming a subtle supporting player. In this particular technique, I'm doing more than just using it for line work, but also using it to create a monochrome underpainting on which I'm going to place my washes of transparent watercolor. While you can do this technique with any number of neutral colored ink colors, this grayish brown gives you the perfect base, adding a gentle color complexity and warmth. The key here is to make sure that those monochrome washes are on the lighter side, since if you go too dark, it'll mute the colors you place on top. That said, this technique is inherently muted, so expect a softer, darker effect than if you're using pure watercolor all by itself. Now that the monochrome stage is done, I start applying the color. Mixing colors in this technique is a little different than working in pure watercolor, in that I have to anticipate how the color will appear over the grayish washes. As a general rule, you should make your colors more saturated, and you can also use opacity by adding touches of white, but for this sketch, I didn't do that. While I finish up, let's talk about this ink. A large number of my viewers have recommended Rohrer and Klingner waterproof inks over the years, and I have to say, this ink has lived up to my expectations. In terms of performance, it performs nearly perfectly, with great flow and solid waterproof properties. But I think its main strength lies in its unique color. While calling it dark brown may be false advertising, the gentle pinch of warmth makes it a better choice than some of the other gray inks in my collection, such as Noodler's Lexington Gray, an ink that I absolutely love, but whose icy blue undertone doesn't play as well with color washes placed on top of it. So, this ink really hits all the bases. On its own, it's dark enough that I can get a full range of contrast, and its transparency and warmth gives my drawings a pleasing softness and vintage sepia feel. And it so happens that it also integrates perfectly with watercolor, being dark enough not to get lost even with very dark applications of wash, and having a lovely color complexity that plays well with whatever colors I place on top of it. As mentioned, this is the only ink I took with me on my trip this summer, and while I tend to be fidgety when it comes to inks and enjoy switching inks often, I never felt like I needed anything else, which is about as good an endorsement as I can give to any ink. The next ink I'm going to review is on the extreme other end of the color spectrum. While Rohrer and Klingner Lily is almost too desaturated to qualify as a brown, this ink, made by Diamine, called Butterscotch, can almost be considered an earth yellow. Let's run it through my tests. In the ink blob sea monster test, the ink shows itself to be uniform in color and very similar to a color called raw sienna, which is a slightly darker, more orange version of yellow ochre. Fountain pen ink companies don't list the pigments used in their inks, and by the way, if they want more artists to use them, they absolutely should. But this to me looks like many of the synthetic iron oxide pigments found either in burnt sienna or raw sienna paints. This ink is fairly transparent, but due to it being lighter in value, I rate the shading effect here as medium. And as for the color variation, there is some with the darker aspect being ruddier and the lighter aspect where it leans more dull yellow. The flow of the ink is quite good, but not as good as the Rohrer and Klingner Lily ink. Though that's not an issue with a wet pen like this, keep in mind that if you're using this ink with a drier writing pen, it'll put down an even lighter line. This is something to consider when using these lighter transparent inks. The value of the line will vary greatly depending on the pen you're using. And in the waterproof test, this ink performed perfectly. Part of it may have to do with the drier nature of the ink so that the lines were not quite as wet, but even then, the almost complete lack of residue was surprising and impressive. One thing I noticed is that this ink is shiny when it dries, similar to some of the shellac-based inks used in dip pens. Could this ink have a binding agent causing the shininess? If anyone has insight in this, let me know. Let's do a drawing, demonstrate a new sketching technique, and talk about whether this is a good candidate for your collection. On its own, this ink has a very lovely color, but being on the lighter side might need to be supplemented with a second ink of a darker value to get a full range of contrast. While not ideal for the underpainting technique demonstrated in my previous sketch, adjusting the technique a little can lead to some interesting results. What I'm going to show you is inspired by the work of the Dutch landscape masters, who often painted their landscapes over a yellowish-brown surface. This gave their paintings a greater liveliness and complexity of color, with the warm yellow ground glowing through the often gray and dull greenery depicted over it. While those painters worked in oil, such an effect can be mimicked in watercolor by mixing it with a touch of white. The process starts by washing over the entire drawing with a dilution of ink and doing a monochrome underpainting. Since the ink is light in value, you're not going to be able to go terribly dark, which is actually a good thing, because we'll be going over it with transparent and semi-transparent watercolor, and we need the vibrancy. Once the underpainting is complete, I can start adding watercolors, all of which have some degree of white in them. The key here is to compensate for the yellow color by adding a lot of purple and blue to everything. This can be hard at first, but watercolor is correctable, so once you put down a few incorrect washes, you'll be able to adjust quickly. By the way, I'm using titanium white watercolor paint here rather than my usual zinc white. While zinc white can be used if that's all you have, titanium is a more opaque pigment that works better for this technique. As I finish up, let's talk about whether I think this ink is worth buying. While I absolutely adore this color and love the fact that it's archival, unless it's used on its own for line work and gentle washes, the lightness and strong saturation limit this ink's versatility. So if you want to give this technique a try, absolutely get it, but the strong yellow color of the underpainting layer makes it suitable only for certain kinds of sun-drenched subject matter, or to create paintings where that yellow is a deliberate expressionistic choice. Personally, I don't think I'll be reaching for it often enough to justify the purchase, nor can I give this ink a strong recommendation. Now let's take a look at a more conventional brown ink made by Platinum, the pigmented brown Sepia. Unlike the other two that are relatively new products, this one has been around for years and is a popular choice for artists. The ink blob test shows this ink to be a rich burnt umber color right in the middle of the spectrum of what can be considered brown. While the color is uniform, it does have a tendency towards pink in the very lightest washes. In the shading transparency test, this ink shows itself to be more transparent than the other two, something that is easily seen when putting down line work, where there's a significant difference in value between where the ink pulls up and where it's applied more lightly. It's also fairly uniform in color, but as mentioned, it has a tendency to look almost pink in the very lightest washes. So, in terms of color variation, I'm going to give this ink a medium rating. In the flow test, this ink had a few issues, but only when the pen was flexed heavily at high speed. I would say that the Rohrer and Klingner Lily ink is an outlier here in its extreme wetness, whereas the Diamine and this platinum ink fall more in the normal range. In the water resistance test, I was surprised in that it did not do as well as the previous two inks, creating significant residue even after being given an overnight drying time. Again, this Bristol paper is rough on waterproof inks, and since these things are so heavily dependent on the paper, performance will vary. This is where drawing inks used in dip pens have an advantage, since they depend on binder for their waterproof properties and will be reliably waterproof regardless on what surface you're working on. However, with a soft brown color like this, a touch of residue is really not an issue, since it'll blend into whatever color you're placing on top without much damage, unless of course you're working with very delicate light colors. Let's do a drawing and see how platinum sepia brown performs. I'm going to use a more conventional technique here, but switch out the flex nib in this pen for a Fude nib. I've demonstrated working with Fude nibs on rougher watercolor paper before, but it's one of my favorite techniques since the Fude gives you access to a large vocabulary of scrapey strokes and textures, perfect for quick landscape sketching. I think the transparency of this ink makes it particularly suitable for a technique like this, since the strokes, despite having a bunch of rough edges, still have a softness to them that integrates well with the washes you place on top. As I add my transparent washes of color, let's talk about whether it's a good candidate for your ink collection. The color and transparency of this ink makes it suitable for soft-looking drawings on its own, but unless you're planning to use it with very light washes, it's simply too transparent and is easily overpowered and obscured. This is a terrible shame because there really aren't many options for waterproof inks in this beautiful traditional-looking color. Fortunately, the German ink manufacturer D. Atramentis makes an excellent brown and sepia ink, which is what I would get instead of this one. I hope you found these ink reviews and sketching technique demonstrations useful, and if you did, please subscribe and consider becoming a channel member. By the way, full-length, real-time, non-narrated recordings of me working on these 3 drawings will be available to members. Thank you so much for watching, and hope to see you back in my messy studio very soon. Bye for now.